In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful. In this second part of the subject matter, that is bank interest or riba, we discuss the question of whether the interest charged by the bank is a riba. This discussion is copied from chapter 3 of my book, Islam and Interest. In the light of the clear-cut Quranic definition of ar-riba explained in chapter 1, let us now examine whether the interest taken at some fixed rate by the banks is a riba. In other words, we must see whether by taking the interest, the banks are usurping the rightful earnings or dues of others. While examining this question, we should remember the simple logic that one would usurp the rightful dues of others when one grabs things beyond one's own rightful dues. Banks generally lend money to the business. Suppose A obtains a loan of ₹1,000,000 from a bank and invests the same in a business. He makes a profit. Now, this profit is due not only to the services rendered by A in the business, but also due to the money that he got from the bank. Without the money, there would be no business and no profit. Logically speaking, therefore, the bank is entitled to a reasonable share of the profit. If the interest rate were within this reasonable share, there would be no objection from any quarter. But what if 1. The bank interest would mop up almost the entire profit? 2. The profit is less than the bank interest? Or 3. There is no profit at all? It is the possibility of such adverse casual eventualities occurring. It is the possibility of such adverse eventualities occurring that has prompted the religious leaders to brand bank interest as a riba. But does such branding conform to the Quranic definition of a riba? In order to understand the answer to the question properly, we have first to remind ourselves of the basics of the working of a bank. Banks are in the business of providing money for other businesses, big and small, industrial and commercial. The banking business is an essential business, for without it, most other businesses would come to a grinding halt. The banks themselves get the money from the savings accounts kept and term deposits made by the people with them. To attract these accounts and deposits, the banks have to offer interest thereon. In developing countries like India and Pakistan, the interest rates it has been observed, are lower than the inflation rates there. Banks are large organizations and they incur large organizational expenses like staff, salaries, building material, building rentals, etc. The banks have therefore legitimately to charge interest at rates enough to cover all their expenses and make a reasonable profit. The profit margin must be as small as possible. Otherwise, the respective borrowers would go Otherwise, the prospective borrowers would go to other banks where the lending rates are lower. In this scenario, no one can, by any stretch of imagination, say that what the banks are getting by way of interest are not their rightful earnings or dues. The banks cannot, therefore, be justifiably accused of usurping the rightful dues or earnings of others. They cannot, in other words, be accused of taking a riba in terms of the Quran. The banks cannot, therefore, be accused of taking a riba even in the extreme case of the borrower sustaining a loss in his business. The banks cannot be held responsible for the loss. The responsibility for and the risk of investing the money in the borrower's business are entirely that of the borrower. The bank is concerned with its own business, the banking business. Like any other business, it has a right to claim a reasonable profit for the service it is rendering, namely, providing the money for other businesses. The money lent plus proportionate expenses incurred plus a reasonable profit are the legitimate dues of the bank payable by the borrower. The legitimate dues cannot be denied to the bank even when the borrower sustains a loss in his business. This is just as a seller of steel cannot be legally denied his dues from a builder who had purchased the steel on credit, but the building which he was constructing had collapsed for reasons which had nothing to do with steel. The argument in the foregoing paragraph derives additional support from the Quranic verse 279, that is verse 279 of Surah number 2, stating that a person desisting from taking a riba is entitled to his amwal, that is, to his rightful earnings and dues. This verse makes it crystal clear that claiming one's rightful earnings or dues is not a riba, even when the borrower sustains a loss. The Quran, however, advises the lender, that is the bank here, to give more time to the borrower in such cases to enable the latter to return the dues of the former. In the extreme case of the borrower going bankrupt, the Quran advises that it would be better for the lender to write off his dues Quranic verse 280 of Surah number 2. A good reputed bank would be just that, would do just that. A good reputed bank would do just that. It would provide for such write-offs. From the detailed discussions above in this chapter and in chapter 1, it would be abundantly clear that bank interest, as generally obtained in the present day world, is not a riba in terms of the Quranic definition. That Islam bans such interest as being a riba is a fallacy. The tragedy is that the fallacy is perpetrated and perpetuated by the protagonists of the religion themselves.